The summer heat of Florence pressed down upon the stone corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, as Lorenzo de' Medici received word that his enemies had spread rumors questioning his legitimacy as ruler. His advisors, faces flushed with indignation, urged immediate action. "We must respond, Lorenzo. We must defend your honor," they cried, their voices echoing off the ancient walls. But Lorenzo merely smiled, his fingers tracing the spine of a leather-bound manuscript on his desk, a work by a certain political theorist named Niccolo Machiavelli. "Tell me," Lorenzo said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "when a mountain is accused of being too tall, does it shrink itself to appease the valley? When the sun is criticized for burning too bright, does it dim its light?" The advisors fell silent, confusion replacing their urgency. Lorenzo continued, "Power that defends itself reveals its own fragility. Power that stands immutable in the face of criticism demonstrates its true nature. This scene, whether historical or imagined, captures the essence of a profound truth that Machiavelli understood better than perhaps any political philosopher before or since. The most powerful individuals in history have rarely felt compelled to defend themselves against their critics. This paradox, that true strength manifests not in defense but in indifference, forms the cornerstone of understanding how power actually operates in the real world. Machiavelli observed that when a ruler spends time defending himself against accusations, he inadvertently grants those accusations power over him. The very act of defense suggests that the criticism has merit worthy of address. More dangerously, it positions the ruler as a reactor rather than an actor, transforming him from the one who sets the agenda to one who responds to it. In the subtle mathematics of power, this represents a fundamental shift in the balance of control. Consider the great powers of history. Augustus Caesar never felt compelled to defend his rise to power against those who called him a usurper. Napoleon Bonaparte did not waste time addressing critics who questioned his authority while he was reshaping the map of Europe. Henry VIII of England responded to papal criticism not with theological arguments but with the creation of an entirely new church. These men understood intuitively what Machiavelli would later codify, that power is not maintained through justification but through demonstration. The weak man, by contrast, lives in constant defense. He explains his decisions, justifies his actions, and seeks approval for his choices. He believes that if only he can make others understand his reasoning, if only he can present his case clearly enough, then he will be accepted and respected. This fundamental misunderstanding of how power operates becomes his ultimate weakness. For in the act of explanation, he reveals that he considers himself answerable to others, and in that revelation, his power begins to dissolve. The transformation from weakness to strength, from defender to sovereign, requires what Machiavelli termed the destruction of the weak self. This is not merely a metaphor, but a practical necessity. The weak self is that part of a man that seeks approval, that fears judgment, that believes his worth is determined by others' opinions. This weak self is not evil. Indeed, in many contexts, it represents admirable human qualities of humility and consideration. But it is fundamentally incompatible with the exercise of real power. The process of destroying the weak self begins with a recognition of its nature. Every time a man feels the urge to explain himself, every time he seeks to justify his actions to those who have not earned the right to judge him, every time he modifies his behavior based on criticism from those whose approval he should not require, in each of these moments, the weak self asserts its dominance over him. The strong man learns to recognize these impulses and, through conscious effort, to resist them. This resistance is not born of arrogance or cruelty. Rather, it stems from an understanding of responsibility. The man who would wield power effectively must understand that his primary obligation is to his mission, his vision, and his responsibilities, not to the comfort or approval of those around him. When he allows the opinions of others to divert him from his path, he betrays not only himself but all those who depend upon his leadership. The historical record provides countless examples of leaders who fell precisely because they allowed the weak self to govern their responses to criticism. King Louis XVI of France spent his final years attempting to defend and justify his every decision to his critics, making concession after concession in the hope of winning approval. Each defense weakened him further. Each justification diminished his authority, until eventually he had explained away his right to rule entirely. His wife, Marie Antoinette, reportedly never said, "Let them eat cake," but she might as well have, for her husband's constant attempts to defend her, to justify her actions, and to seek approval for her role only drew more attention to every perceived slight and excess. The strong ruler, by contrast, understands that his actions must speak for themselves. When criticism comes, he neither deflects nor defends, but simply continues his work. If his policies are successful, the success serves as his vindication. If his decisions prove wise, wisdom becomes his defense. If his leadership produces results, results become his justification. He allows reality to make his case for him, rather than attempting to craft that case through words and explanations. This approach requires tremendous internal strength, for it means accepting that some will misunderstand, some will criticize, and some will oppose him regardless of his explanations. The weak self rebels against this acceptance, crying out that surely if people just understood the full situation, if they could see the complexity of the decisions he faces, if they could appreciate the pressures and responsibilities he carries, then they would be more sympathetic. But the strong man recognizes this cry as the voice of weakness seeking to reassert itself. The path to this strength is not traveled overnight. It requires consistent practice in small matters before it can be applied to great ones. When a colleague questions a minor decision, the developing leader learns to respond with simple acknowledgement rather than detailed justification. When friends or family criticize his choices, he practices receiving their input without feeling compelled to defend or explain. These small exercises in non-defense build the psychological muscle necessary for maintaining composure under more significant pressure. The transformation becomes complete when defense is no longer a struggle against natural impulses, but has been replaced by a genuine indifference to the approval of others. This is not the indifference of nihilism or depression, but the focused indifference of a surgeon who cannot be distracted by the cries of the patient while performing a life-saving operation. The surgeon's indifference to the patient's immediate discomfort serves the patient's ultimate well-being. Similarly, the leader's indifference to popular approval often serves the ultimate well-being of those he leads. Yet this indifference must be balanced with wisdom. The powerful man does not ignore all feedback or criticism. That would be the foolishness of the tyrant. Rather, he carefully selects whose opinions merit his consideration. He listens to those whose judgment he respects, whose expertise surpasses his own in relevant areas, and whose loyalty to his mission is unquestionable. But he does not feel compelled to respond publicly to their private counsel, nor to justify his decisions to the broader world based on their input. The distinction is crucial. Private consultation with trusted advisors is a mark of wisdom. Public defense against general criticism is a sign of weakness. The powerful man may spend hours in private deliberation, seeking counsel, weighing options, and considering consequences. But once he has made his decision and taken his action, he does not feel compelled to share that deliberative process with the world. The world sees only the decision and its results. This approach extends beyond formal leadership roles into every aspect of life where power dynamics exist. In business, the executive who constantly explains and justifies his decisions to subordinates undermines his own authority. In relationships, the partner who endlessly defends his choices weakens the very foundation upon which the relationship rests. In social situations, the individual who feels compelled to justify his lifestyle, his choices, or his values to casual acquaintances reveals his own insecurity about those choices. The weak self believes that understanding leads to acceptance, that explanation produces approval, and that justification generates respect. Experience teaches otherwise. Respect is earned not through explanation, but through consistent action. Approval that must be won through justification is temporary and conditional. Understanding that requires extensive explanation often reveals the complexity and uncertainty that the weak self hoped to hide. The strong man operates from a different premise entirely. He assumes that those who need to understand his actions will understand them from observing their effects. He trusts that those whose approval matters will grant it based on results rather than explanations. He believes that respect flows naturally to those who demonstrate competence and consistency, not to those who argue for recognition. This is not to suggest that communication is unimportant or that the powerful man remains silent in all circumstances. Rather, he communicates from a position of strength rather than defensiveness. When he speaks, it is to inform, to instruct, or to inspire, not to justify or defend. When he explains his thinking, it is to help others learn or to provide context for future actions, not to gain approval for past decisions. The difference in these approaches is subtle but profound. The defensive explanation seeks to change the listener's mind about a judgment already made. The instructive explanation seeks to share knowledge for the listener's benefit. The justifying statement attempts to prove the rightness of a past action. The informative statement provides context for understanding current and future actions. One seeks permission retroactively, the other provides information proactively. Machiavelli understood that this distinction lies at the heart of effective leadership. The prince who governs by seeking retroactive approval for his decisions has already surrendered his sovereignty to those from whom he seeks that approval. The prince who acts decisively and allows his actions to demonstrate their wisdom maintains his authority while achieving his objectives. The man who would transform himself from weakness to strength must therefore develop what might be called sovereign consciousness, an internal awareness of his own authority over his decisions and his life. This sovereignty is not granted by others but claimed by the individual himself. It cannot be taken away by criticism because it was never dependent upon approval. It cannot be undermined by attacks because it was not built upon the foundation of others' opinions. Sovereign consciousness recognizes that every individual has the inherent right and responsibility to govern his own life according to his own judgment. This does not mean that his judgment is always correct or that his decisions are always wise. It means that the authority to make those judgments and decisions rests with him alone, regardless of how others might evaluate his choices. The weak self rejects this responsibility, preferring to share the burden of decision-making with others through their approval. If others approve of his choices, then the weak self feels validated. If others disapprove, then the weak self feels compelled to defend or change course. In either case, the weak self has surrendered sovereignty to external validators. The strong self embraces this responsibility completely. He makes his decisions based on his best judgment, informed by whatever counsel he deems valuable, guided by his principles and objectives, and implemented according to his capabilities. He accepts full responsibility for the consequences, whether positive or negative. He does not seek to share credit for successes or blame others for failures. This complete ownership of his choices paradoxically makes him less vulnerable to attack, for there is nothing to defend, only results to evaluate and future decisions to make. The psychological shift from defensiveness to sovereignty often involves a period of discomfort. The weak self, accustomed to external validation, rebels against the isolation that sovereignty can bring. Friends and colleagues who are accustomed to having their approval sought may feel rejected when it is no longer requested. Critics who are used to receiving defensive responses may escalate their attacks when those responses are no longer forthcoming. This period tests the resolve of the transforming individual. The temptation to return to old patterns of explanation and justification can be overwhelming, especially when the social costs of sovereignty become apparent. But those who persist through this transitional period discover that the apparent isolation is temporary. People adjust to the new dynamic, often with increased respect for the individual who no longer seeks their approval. Critics either escalate to irrelevance or find new targets. Most importantly, the individual discovers an internal peace and strength that no external validation could provide. The destruction of the weak self is not a single event but an ongoing process. Each day presents new opportunities to choose sovereignty over defensiveness, strength over the need for approval, action over explanation. Each choice in this direction makes the next choice easier, building the internal strength necessary to maintain power in an increasingly complex world. As we stand at the threshold of understanding how this transformation occurs, we must recognize that the journey from weakness to strength is not merely personal development, it is preparation for the exercise of real power in the world. The man who cannot govern himself, who remains subject to the approval and disapproval of others, cannot effectively govern anything else. But the man who has destroyed his weak self, who has claimed sovereignty over his own life and decisions, has taken the first essential step toward wielding power that cannot be taken from him. Part 2. The Architecture of Invincibility. The morning mist clung to the Tuscan hills as Cesare Borgia rode toward Urbino with a force of 3,000 men. His reputation preceded him like a shadow cast by fire, whispered stories of calculated ruthlessness, strategic brilliance, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his enemies' moves. What his enemies did not understand, what made him truly formidable, was not his military prowess or his father's papal influence, but his complete indifference to their opinions of his character. "They call you cruel," his lieutenant had mentioned the previous evening, expecting perhaps some defense or justification. Cesare had merely smiled, that enigmatic expression that had become his trademark. "Let them," he replied, returning to his maps. "A prince who is thought cruel but maintains order serves his subjects better than one who is thought merciful but allows chaos to flourish." He understood what his critics could not grasp. That reputation, like power itself, is not built through the stories others tell about you, but through the undeniable reality of your results. This scene illustrates the second crucial principle in the architecture of invincibility. The powerful man recognizes that his strength lies not in how he is perceived, but in what he accomplishes. While others exhaust themselves managing impressions and crafting narratives, he focuses entirely on outcomes. This singular focus becomes both his method and his protection. The weak man lives in constant fear of misunderstanding. He believes that if others truly knew his intentions, if they could see his heart, if they understood his circumstances, then they would approve of his actions. This belief drives him to endless explanation, constant justification, and perpetual defense. He fails to recognize that the more he explains, the more he appears to need explanation. The more he justifies, the more his actions seem to require justification. The more he defends, the more vulnerable he appears to be. The strong man operates from an entirely different understanding. He recognizes that intention without result is worthless, that good motives cannot excuse bad outcomes, and that the world ultimately judges by effects rather than efforts. Therefore, he pours all his energy into ensuring that his actions produce the results he desires. He allows those results to speak for themselves, understanding that success is the most eloquent defense and failure the most damning accusation, regardless of any explanation he might offer. This principle extends far beyond the realm of military conquest or political maneuvering. In every sphere of human endeavor, the architecture of invincibility follows the same blueprint: clear objectives, decisive action, consistent results, and complete indifference to criticism that does not contribute to improved outcomes. The businessman who transforms a failing company does not spend time defending his methods to those who predicted his failure. He allows the company's revival to serve as his vindication. The artist who creates groundbreaking work does not engage with critics who cannot appreciate his vision. He continues creating, allowing his body of work to build his reputation organically. The construction of this invincibility begins with what Machiavelli termed the clarity of purpose. The man who would be truly powerful must first know exactly what he seeks to accomplish. This seems simple, yet it represents the point where most individuals fail. They pursue vague goals like success or happiness or respect, without defining what these concepts mean in practical terms. Without clear definition, they cannot develop effective strategies. Without effective strategies, they cannot achieve consistent results. Without consistent results, they remain vulnerable to every critic who questions their methods or challenges their authority. The powerful man defines his objectives with mathematical precision. If he seeks to build a business, he specifies exactly what type of business, serving what market, achieving what level of revenue, within what time frame. If he pursues a relationship, he clarifies what qualities he values in a partner, what type of life he wishes to build together, what role the relationship plays in his broader objectives. If he develops his character, he identifies specific traits he wishes to strengthen, behaviors he wishes to eliminate, and principles he wishes to embody consistently. This precision serves multiple purposes. First, it provides clear criteria for evaluating decisions. Every choice can be measured against whether it advances his defined objectives. Second, it eliminates the ambiguity that criticism often exploits. When goals are vague, critics can always claim that different approaches would be more effective. Third, it creates accountability, both to himself and to others, for producing measurable results rather than merely demonstrable effort. But clarity of purpose alone is insufficient. The architecture of invincibility requires what might be called strategic patience, the ability to remain focused on long-term objectives despite short-term pressures to explain, defend, or adjust course based on immediate feedback. This patience is perhaps the most difficult aspect of power to develop, for it requires resisting the natural human desire for immediate validation and acceptance. The weak man cannot tolerate misunderstanding, even temporarily. When criticized, he feels compelled to correct the record immediately. When questioned, he believes he must provide immediate answers. When attacked, he thinks he must respond without delay. This urgency transforms him into a reactor, constantly responding to others' agendas rather than pursuing his own. More dangerously, it prevents him from taking actions that might be misunderstood in the short term, but prove wise in the long term. The strong man understands that some of his most important decisions will be misunderstood initially. He accepts that some of his most effective actions will appear harsh, unfair, or even cruel to those who cannot see the full context or cannot appreciate the long-term consequences of inaction. He tolerates this misunderstanding because he knows that time and results will vindicate his choices more effectively than any explanation ever could. Consider the executive who must terminate several employees to prevent the collapse of a company. The weak executive either avoids making these difficult decisions, allowing the entire organization to fail, or makes them while constantly explaining and apologizing, undermining his own authority and the necessity of his actions. The strong executive makes the difficult decisions, accepts the criticism and disapproval that follows, and focuses entirely on implementing the changes necessary to restore the company's health. 6 months later, when the company is thriving and the remaining employees are secure in their positions, the wisdom of his actions becomes apparent to all. This pattern repeats across every domain of leadership. The parent who enforces difficult but necessary boundaries with a child faces temporary disapproval but builds long-term respect and provides essential structure for the child's development. The teacher who maintains high standards despite student complaints ultimately serves those students better than one who lowers expectations to maintain popularity. The leader who makes unpopular but necessary changes to an organization serves that organization's mission more effectively than one who avoids difficult decisions to preserve immediate harmony. The architecture of invincibility is built upon this willingness to accept short-term misunderstanding for long-term effectiveness. But this willingness must be balanced with strategic wisdom. The powerful man does not court misunderstanding for its own sake or make decisions more difficult than necessary simply to appear strong. Rather, he focuses entirely on what is required to achieve his objectives, accepting whatever temporary discomfort this focus might create. This leads to the third pillar of invincibility: emotional independence. The weak man's emotional state fluctuates based on others' approval or disapproval of his actions. When praised, he feels validated and confident. When criticized, he feels attacked and uncertain. This emotional dependency creates a vulnerability that skilled opponents can exploit. By controlling his emotional rewards and punishments, they can effectively control his behavior. The strong man has severed this connection between others' opinions and his emotional state. His confidence comes from his track record of achievement, his sense of purpose, and his understanding of his own capabilities. His satisfaction derives from progress toward his objectives, the quality of his work, and the alignment between his actions and his principles. While he may appreciate recognition when it comes, he does not require it for his emotional well-being. While he may regret criticism when it is unjust, he does not allow it to shake his fundamental confidence in his path. This emotional independence is not achieved through suppression of feeling or cultivation of indifference to others. Rather, it comes from establishing internal rather than external sources of validation. The powerful man learns to recognize when he has done his best work regardless of whether others appreciate it. He develops the ability to evaluate his own performance honestly, celebrating genuine achievements while acknowledging areas for improvement. He builds his identity around his character and capabilities rather than his reputation or others' perceptions. The development of emotional independence often requires a period of conscious separation from external validation. Like an athlete who must build strength by progressively increasing resistance, the developing leader must gradually reduce his dependence on approval and criticism as sources of emotional feedback. This might mean spending less time with people who constantly seek to influence his mood through praise or condemnation. It might require avoiding social media or other platforms where immediate feedback creates artificial emotional rewards and punishments. It might involve developing internal practices, meditation, journaling, or simply regular self-reflection that strengthen his ability to evaluate his own progress objectively. The fourth pillar of invincibility is what Machiavelli termed the discipline of action. The weak man often substitutes planning for doing, thinking for acting, or discussing for implementing. He believes that if he can just develop the perfect plan, consider every possible angle, or gain consensus from all relevant parties, then his actions will be beyond criticism. This perfectionist paralysis prevents him from developing the practical wisdom that comes only from experience and leaves him vulnerable to more decisive competitors. The strong man understands that action itself is a form of power. When he acts decisively, he changes the circumstances that others must respond to. He moves from being acted upon to being the actor. He transforms theoretical discussions into practical realities that must be dealt with concretely rather than abstractly. This shift in dynamic often eliminates criticism more effectively than any defense ever could, for it is much easier to criticize a plan than to argue with a successful result. The discipline of action requires what might be called intelligent boldness, the ability to act decisively while accepting imperfect information and uncertain outcomes. This is not recklessness, which acts without consideration of consequences, but rather the courage to act despite the inability to guarantee success. The powerful man gathers the information available to him, considers the options within his reach, makes the best decision possible with the resources at hand, and then commits fully to that decision's implementation. This commitment to action creates its own momentum. Each successful action builds confidence for the next decision. Each problem solved through decisive implementation rather than endless deliberation strengthens the habit of action over the habit of hesitation. Each result achieved through bold implementation rather than perfect planning demonstrates the practical superiority of doing over planning. The discipline of action also provides natural protection against criticism. It is much more difficult to criticize someone who is actively working to solve problems than someone who is merely talking about potential solutions. The person who acts, even imperfectly, contributes tangible value that others can evaluate objectively. The person who hesitates, regardless of how thoughtful his hesitation might be, produces nothing that others can judge except the hesitation itself. The fifth and perhaps most crucial pillar of invincibility is the cultivation of what might be termed outcome obsession. The weak man focuses on inputs, his effort, his intentions, his methods, his circumstances. When criticized, he defends these inputs. He worked hard, he meant well, he followed proper procedures, he faced difficult conditions. The strong man focuses exclusively on outputs, his results, his impact, his achievements, his contributions to others' well-being or success. This shift in focus transforms every aspect of how power is exercised. When evaluating his own performance, the outcome-obsessed leader asks not whether he tried his best or whether his methods were appropriate, but whether he achieved his objectives and served those who depend on his leadership. When facing criticism, he asks not whether the criticism is fair or the critic's well-intentioned, but whether the criticism points to ways he can improve his results. When making decisions, he chooses not the approach that will earn the most approval or cause the least controversy, but the approach most likely to produce the outcomes he seeks. Outcome obsession naturally eliminates much potential criticism because it aligns the leader's interests with those he serves. The business leader who is genuinely obsessed with his customers' success will make decisions that benefit those customers, even when those decisions are initially unpopular with employees or investors. Over time, the customer's success creates the foundation for everyone else's success, vindicating the leader's focus. The political leader who is genuinely obsessed with his citizens' well-being will sometimes make unpopular decisions that serve the long-term interests of the community, earning eventual gratitude even from those who opposed him initially. This alignment between the leader's obsession and others' interests creates a natural defense against attacks on his character or methods. Critics may question his motivations, but they cannot argue with results that clearly benefit those he serves. They may disapprove of his style, but they cannot deny outcomes that improve others' lives. They may prefer different approaches, but they struggle to explain why different approaches would be superior when his current approach is working effectively. The architecture of invincibility, when properly constructed, creates what might be called a fortress of results. This fortress is not built of excuses, explanations, or justifications, but of consistent achievement. It is not defended through argument or debate, but through continued performance. It cannot be torn down by criticism or attack, but only by failure to continue producing the outcomes upon which it was built. The man who inhabits this fortress finds that criticism becomes largely irrelevant to his effectiveness. He neither seeks it out nor avoids it, but simply continues his work while allowing others to evaluate his efforts however they choose. He understands that those whose approval matters will grant it based on his results, while those whose disapproval he cannot avoid through explanation will likely disapprove regardless of his efforts to defend himself. This fortress of results also provides protection against the emotional toll that sustained criticism can create. When a man knows that his work is producing genuine value for others, that his decisions are based on careful consideration of what will best serve his objectives, and that his methods are consistently generating positive outcomes, he can weather criticism with equanimity. The criticism may be unpleasant, but it cannot shake his fundamental confidence in his path or his methods. The construction of this fortress requires patience, for results often take time to become apparent to others. It requires consistency, for occasional successes are easily dismissed as luck, while sustained performance cannot be ignored. It requires wisdom, for focusing on outcomes means accepting responsibility for failures as completely as claiming credit for successes. But for those who build it successfully, it provides a foundation for exercising power that cannot be shaken by the opinions of others. As we prepare to explore the final transformation, from external invincibility to internal sovereignty, we must recognize that the architecture of invincibility is not merely a defensive structure. It is an active force that enables its inhabitant to shape the world according to his vision, rather than merely responding to others' agendas. The man who has built this fortress finds that he no longer needs to defend himself, because he has created something worth more than his reputation. He has created genuine value in the world. Part 3. The Sovereign Self and the Transcendence of Weakness. The bells of San Lorenzo had just finished chiming the hour of Vespers when Niccolo Machiavelli set down his quill and gazed out at the darkening Florentine sky. For months he had been wrestling with a paradox that seemed to contradict everything he thought he understood about human nature and political power. The most successful rulers he had observed, those who wielded authority with apparent effortlessness and maintained their positions despite constant challenges, shared a quality that seemed almost mystical in its effects. They appeared genuinely indifferent to whether others loved or hated them, not indifferent to the consequences of others' feelings. That would be the folly of a tyrant. Rather, they seemed to have transcended the fundamental human need for approval that drove most men's decisions. They acted from an internal compass so strong and clear that external validation became superfluous. They had, in effect, become sovereigns not just over territories or organizations, but over their own psychological responses to the judgment of others. This observation would become the cornerstone of Machiavelli's most profound insight. That true power begins not with the control of others, but with the complete mastery of oneself. The prince who could not govern his own need for approval would inevitably surrender his sovereignty to those whose approval he craved. The leader who remained psychologically dependent on external validation would always be vulnerable to manipulation by those who controlled the sources of that validation. The journey to this ultimate form of power, what we might call sovereign selfhood, represents the final and most challenging transformation in the development of unshakable strength. It requires not merely the elimination of defensive behaviors or the cultivation of strategic patience, but a fundamental reconstruction of the self around principles that exist independently of others' recognition or approval. The weak self, as we have seen, derives its sense of worth from external sources. It feels valuable when praised, diminished when criticized, confident when approved of, and uncertain when faced with disapproval. This external orientation creates an endless cycle of vulnerability. No amount of approval is ever sufficient to provide lasting security, for there is always the possibility that future critics will withdraw their support. No achievement is ever enough to guarantee continued recognition, for there are always new challenges that might result in failure. No reputation is ever secure enough to eliminate the fear of future attacks, for there are always those who might benefit from undermining that reputation. The sovereign self operates from an entirely different foundation. Its sense of worth derives from internal alignment, the consistency between its actions and its principles, the integrity with which it pursues its objectives, the quality of the character it has built through conscious choice and sustained effort. This internal orientation creates a stability that external circumstances cannot shake. Criticism may be unpleasant, but it cannot alter the sovereign self's fundamental understanding of its own worth. Failure may be disappointing, but it cannot destroy the sovereign self's confidence in its ability to learn and grow from experience. Attack may be painful, but it cannot undermine the sovereign self's commitment to its chosen path. The development of sovereign selfhood begins with what philosophers have termed the examined life, a commitment to understanding oneself with the same rigor and objectivity that one would apply to understanding any other complex system. This examination requires brutal honesty about one's motivations, capabilities, and patterns of behavior. It demands the courage to acknowledge weaknesses without defensiveness and strengths without arrogance. Most challenging of all, it requires the willingness to accept responsibility for one's circumstances, choices, and their consequences without seeking to blame others or external factors for difficulties encountered along the way. This self-examination often reveals the extent to which the weak self has been governing decisions and actions. The sovereign in development begins to notice how often he modifies his behavior based on others' potential reactions, how frequently he chooses comfort over growth to avoid criticism, and how consistently he seeks external validation for internal decisions. These patterns, once unconscious, become visible through sustained self-observation, and what becomes visible can be changed through conscious effort and sustained practice. The process of transformation from external to internal orientation requires what might be called principled detachment. This does not mean becoming cold or indifferent to others' well-being, but rather detaching one's sense of self-worth from others' opinions while remaining fully engaged with serving their genuine interests. The sovereign leader cares deeply about the welfare of those he serves, but he does not require their gratitude or approval to maintain his commitment to their service. The sovereign parent loves his children completely, but he does not modify his principles or abandon necessary discipline to maintain their immediate affection. This detachment allows for what Machiavelli recognized as the highest form of service, the willingness to accept temporary unpopularity in order to provide what others truly need, rather than what they might initially want. The weak leader, dependent on approval, often gives people what will make them happy in the short term, even when he knows this will harm them in the long term. The sovereign leader gives people what will serve their genuine interests, accepting whatever temporary disapproval this might create. The cultivation of principled detachment requires the development of internal anchors, sources of meaning, purpose, and identity that exist independently of others' recognition. These anchors might include philosophical principles that guide decision-making regardless of circumstances, spiritual practices that connect the individual to purposes larger than immediate self-interest, or life missions that provide meaning independent of external achievement or recognition. For some, these anchors take the form of service to others, not for the gratitude or recognition such service might bring, but for the intrinsic value of contributing to others' well-being. For others, they involve the pursuit of excellence in chosen fields, not for the acclaim such excellence might generate, but for the satisfaction of developing and expressing human potential fully. For still others, they center around the creation of beauty, truth, or justice in the world, not for the appreciation these creations might receive, but for the inherent worth of bringing such qualities into existence. The specific nature of these anchors matters less than their independence from external validation. They must be sources of meaning that remain meaningful regardless of whether others recognize their value. They must provide satisfaction that exists independently of others' approval or disapproval. They must offer purpose that transcends the immediate circumstances of the individual's life and connects him to something larger and more enduring than his personal comfort or recognition. The sovereign self, anchored in these internal sources of meaning, develops what might be termed transcendent perspective, the ability to view immediate circumstances, including criticism and attack, within the context of larger purposes and longer timeframes. This perspective transforms the emotional impact of criticism from devastating judgment to useful information. The sovereign self can receive feedback about his performance without interpreting it as a verdict on his worth as a person. He can acknowledge mistakes without allowing them to undermine his fundamental confidence in his path and purpose. This transcendent perspective also enables the sovereign self to distinguish between different types of criticism and respond to each appropriately. Criticism from those whose judgment he respects, whose expertise exceeds his own in relevant areas, and whose commitment to his success is demonstrated receives serious consideration. Such criticism is evaluated on its merits and incorporated into future decision-making when valuable. Criticism from those who lack relevant expertise, who have demonstrated poor judgment in the past, or who appear motivated by envy or malice receives polite acknowledgement but does not influence his actions or emotional state. Most importantly, the sovereign self recognizes that some criticism is inevitable and even necessary. Excellence in any field requires pushing beyond conventional boundaries, which will inevitably disturb those who are comfortable with existing limitations. Leadership requires making decisions that benefit some while disappointing others, which will inevitably create opposition from those whose interests are not prioritized. Growth requires experimenting with new approaches, which will inevitably produce failures that critics can highlight and condemn. The sovereign self accepts this inevitability without resentment or defensiveness. He understands that the choice is not between being criticized and being praised, but between being criticized for attempting important work and being ignored for attempting nothing of significance. He prefers the criticism that comes with meaningful endeavor to the safety that comes with mediocrity. This acceptance of inevitable criticism paradoxically provides protection against its effects. The man who expects criticism and has prepared himself psychologically to receive it without reactive defensiveness often finds that criticism has much less power over him than he anticipated. Critics who expected to provoke defensive reactions often lose interest when those reactions are not forthcoming. Criticism that was intended to derail his efforts often fails to do so when he receives it calmly and continues his work without interruption. The sovereign self also develops what might be called strategic appreciation, the ability to find value even in unfair or malicious criticism. This does not mean accepting false accusations or thanking attackers for their hostility, but rather extracting whatever useful information might exist within even biased or hostile feedback. The sovereign leader recognizes that critics often notice real problems, even when they misdiagnose causes or propose inappropriate solutions. By filtering criticism for useful information while ignoring the emotional content designed to provoke defensive reactions, he can improve his performance while remaining unmoved by attacks on his character. This strategic approach to criticism represents one of the most practical advantages of sovereign selfhood. While his critics exhaust themselves attempting to provoke emotional reactions that never come, the sovereign self continues to learn, grow, and improve his effectiveness. He benefits from the attention his critics pay to his work, often noticing problems or opportunities that he might have overlooked without their hostile scrutiny. In effect, he transforms his enemies into unwitting consultants who help him refine his approach while strengthening his position. The development of sovereign selfhood ultimately leads to what Machiavelli would have recognized as the highest form of power: the ability to remain completely focused on one's mission, regardless of external circumstances. This focus creates an almost magnetic quality that draws others to follow and support the sovereign individual's efforts. People recognize, often unconsciously, the strength that comes from complete internal alignment, and the trustworthiness that comes from independence from external pressure. The sovereign leader becomes someone others can depend on precisely because his principles and commitments do not shift based on immediate pressures or popular opinion. His followers know that he will make decisions based on what he genuinely believes will serve their interests, not on what will maintain his popularity with them. His enemies know that their attacks will not divert him from his chosen path, making sustained opposition to him ultimately futile, unless they can demonstrate that his path is genuinely harmful to others' interests. This reliability, born of internal sovereignty, creates a form of soft power that often proves more effective than any external pressure or persuasion. People choose to follow sovereign leaders not because they are forced to do so, but because they recognize the strength and consistency that such leaders provide. They trust sovereign leaders not because those leaders court their approval, but because those leaders have demonstrated their independence from the need for approval. The transformation to sovereign selfhood also creates what might be called creative freedom: the ability to pursue innovative solutions and unconventional approaches without being constrained by others' expectations or limited by fear of criticism. The weak self often settles for conventional approaches, even when they are inadequate, because conventional approaches are less likely to be criticized. The sovereign self pursues whatever approaches are most likely to achieve desired outcomes, regardless of whether they conform to others' expectations or preferences. This creative freedom often leads to breakthrough achievements that would have been impossible for someone constrained by the need for approval. The sovereign innovator can explore ideas that seem strange or threatening to others, knowing that results will ultimately vindicate unconventional approaches more effectively than explanation ever could. The sovereign leader can implement necessary changes even when they are initially unpopular, trusting that improved outcomes will eventually demonstrate their wisdom. The cultivation of sovereign selfhood is not a destination but an ongoing practice. Even those who have achieved significant internal independence must continue to monitor their motivations and responses to ensure that the weak self does not reassert itself in subtle ways. The temptation to seek approval, to avoid criticism, or to modify one's path based on others' opinions never completely disappears. But through sustained practice and conscious choice, it becomes manageable and ultimately irrelevant to the sovereign individual's decision-making process. The practices that support sovereign development include regular self-reflection to maintain awareness of one's motivations and patterns, philosophical study to strengthen intellectual foundations for independent judgment, and conscious exposure to situations that test one's independence from external validation. Many find benefit in meditation or other contemplative practices that strengthen their ability to observe their thoughts and emotions without being controlled by them. Others benefit from physical challenges that build confidence in their ability to endure discomfort without external support or encouragement. Perhaps most importantly, the development of sovereign selfhood requires the cultivation of genuine service to others, not for the recognition such service might bring, but for its intrinsic value. The sovereign self finds that serving others' genuine interests, even at the cost of temporary disapproval, provides a satisfaction that no amount of praise or recognition could match. This service-oriented foundation prevents sovereign selfhood from devolving into narcissism or indifference to others' welfare. The man who has achieved sovereign selfhood becomes, in Machiavelli's terms, truly powerful. Not because he can force others to obey him, but because he no longer needs others' permission to be himself. He acts from his deepest convictions, pursues his most important objectives, and serves others according to his highest understanding of their needs. He does all of this without requiring others' approval, appreciation, or even understanding. This is the ultimate paradox of power that Machiavelli observed but perhaps never fully articulated. The man who needs nothing from others has the most to offer them. The leader who is independent of others' approval can serve their interests with perfect integrity. The individual who has transcended the need for external validation can focus completely on creating genuine value in the world. The weak self believes that it must earn the right to exist through others' approval. The sovereign self recognizes that existence itself grants the right to pursue meaning, purpose, and service according to one's deepest understanding. The weak self seeks permission to act from those it hopes to serve. The sovereign self acts from its own authority in service of those same people. In the end, the man who has destroyed his weak self cannot be destroyed by others because there is nothing left that depends on others for its existence. His worth is self-evident to him. His purpose is self-chosen. His principles are self-derived. And his satisfaction comes from self-alignment. Others may criticize, attack, or oppose him, but they cannot touch the essential core from which his strength flows. This is not the strength of isolation or indifference, but the strength of complete internal integration, serving others with perfect independence. It is not the power of domination, but the power of authentic service liberated from the need for recognition. It is not the invincibility of hardness, but the invincibility of a life lived with complete integrity, according to one's deepest understanding of truth and service. The sovereign self stands as Machiavelli's ultimate prince, ruling not territories or organizations, but ruling the only domain that can never be taken away, the kingdom of his own character, choices, and responses to whatever circumstances life might present. From this internal sovereignty flows all other forms of power, and to this internal sovereignty, all other forms of power must ultimately return. The man who has achieved this transformation discovers that he no longer needs to defend himself because he has become something that cannot be attacked. A person whose worth is not dependent on others' recognition, whose purpose is not subject to others' permission, he has become truly free. And from that freedom, he can offer others the most valuable gift of all, leadership that serves their highest interests without being compromised by their immediate preferences or reactions. This is the final teaching of Machiavelli's observation about powerful men who never defend themselves. They have transcended the need for defense by becoming invulnerable to the only attacks that matter, those that would shake their fundamental understanding of who they are and what they are called to do in the world. They have achieved not just external power, but internal sovereignty. And from that sovereignty, they can serve others with a strength and consistency that no amount of external validation could ever provide. In the quiet strength of those who need nothing, others find everything they have been seeking. In the sovereignty of those who serve without requiring recognition, the world discovers leaders worthy of following. In the invincibility of those who have destroyed their weak selves, humanity glimpses the possibility of power used not for domination, but for the elevation of all.